Welcome into Upon Further Review. My name is Jason Ray. I will be your host for the next, probably 45 minutes, 60 minutes, an hour or so, just to see how many people we have in here. So, welcome in. If you missed us last night, go to our page and make sure you take a look at the feed as we covered everything from yesterday's win over Western Carolina, the 76-0 win. Went into depth on some of the things that we thought that was important in terms of the improvement that Oklahoma made from game one to game two. One of the things that you always hear is the biggest improvement any team will make in a given season is from game one to game two. I think certainly, looking back on the game last night, uh, I think as we go into the season a little bit, we'll see that a little bit more. I think it's tough to see given the fact of how much Oklahoma struggled in game one in a lot of different areas, and then secondarily understanding who the opponent was in week two. So I think we'll get a little bit better idea as Oklahoma faces. Probably they're in terms of athletes. I think certainly the best team that they'll face in the non-conference, and I think certainly I think most everyone will agree. I think in terms of a name, Nebraska is a bigger name than Tulane. So we'll get cracking on that. Maybe do a little bit of analysis early on. Here we'll get to some more detailed analysis, later in the week as we go live with Mark. So just a couple of housekeeping things for the rest of the week for you guys to keep in mind. On Wednesday at 11:30 a.m., me and Mark will go live, talk a little bit about Western Carolina, and then move more into Nebraska week, and just kind of look at the matchup as a whole. Haven't had a whole lot of time to study Nebraska. I've watched them. I watched them against Illinois pretty much the entire game, and then watched bits and pieces of their win against Buffalo, which was solid. I think they struggled a little bit against Fordham early on, but then they were so much better than them. Won that game 44-7, and then I think defensively they played much better against Buffalo, only held them to 3 points. I know that Buffalo has lost a lot, including their head coach, Lance Leopold, from last year. So I think it remains to be seen. However, they did hold Buffalo to only 3 points, so I think that was solid. Adrian Martinez was a little bit better in that game against Buffalo. So I think I think we'll see in this game. Number one, I think Oklahoma will be much more amped than they were in any of the previous games. The two games, obviously you have a name like Nebraska, and I think it's going to be, I don't know if I shoved down their throat is the right word to say, but I think there's going to be a lot of attention on this game within the state, within the program itself. So I think that will be enough to keep their attention. So yeah, that will be, I think, a good week of prep and a good week of practice, and then a good week of discussion for us as we'll kind of get into some of that stuff. So Wednesday we'll kind of get into that stuff, and then obviously on Saturday morning probably around 8 a.m. we'll do a pregame show live, and then certainly after the game around 2:30ish, 2:33 time frame, we will do a post game with. Just kind of talking like we always do, taking your questions, taking your comments, and talking about everything Nebraska related and, what this looks like. So don't forget for everyone, don't forget to follow me on Twitter as Jason Ray 1. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button on the channel so that we can get more Sooner fans involved in this. We was really exciting last night. We peaked at 90, so I fully expect, and this is a challenge to everybody watching this. I would certainly expect and would like to see. Let's see us get in the triple digits next Saturday as we look back at what is hopefully an impressive win by Oklahoma. So I think just at the cuff right here, a couple of things. It's going to be I think a pretty good challenge on the offensive line. They're a little bit more athletic and deep at the defensive line. When you look at Adrian Martinez, he's been wildly inconsistent. How consistent can he be in this game for Nebraska, and how Oklahoma is able to kind of keep him in the pocket is going to be a big area of importance for the game on Saturday. And So the other thing that we'll talk through today, and I just wanted to get your thoughts. So obviously, we know that the Oklahoma-Nebraska rivalry has been something obviously that has been missed, over the last few years, and certainly was one of the best rivalries in college football for a while. One that's been built, on respect mostly. So there's some great games, going all the way back to the game of the century in 1971. Great games through the 70s and the 80s, and certainly not necessarily the 90s, but as the 2000s. Um, came about, some really good games there as well until obviously Nebraska exited the Big 12, and there was no more rivalry, no more games here in it, especially every single week. So, or every single year, I should say. So, for no matter how young you are, how old you are, give me some of your most interesting memories. Any memories from attending games, from watching games, anything that kind of stands out as, when you look at Oklahoma's rivalry against Texas, against Oklahoma State, it's really built on hate. Honestly, more than anything, I think there's mutual hate between Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, maybe even more so right now with the pending SEC move, and then looking at Texas. Obviously, that's the most heated rival that Oklahoma has, and it always will be. Always will be like that. So yeah, talk about some, and I'll bring some of mine that I have, and I'm only 40, so I don't have a ton of memories. A couple of bad memories, and then a couple of really good ones that I can share. I can share with you guys. But first things first, a final, just a final look from the upon further review perspective before we kind of get to some of that with Nebraska. I think one of the things that you looked at, you understood the opponent. You still take that a little bit with a grain of salt, but Oklahoma did really almost everything that you would have expected them to do in this game last night. Even watching it again a little bit more today, really nothing changed too much. I was happy with the way Oklahoma came out, specifically in the second half when they had a big lead, and kind of took the pedal to the metal, so to speak, and really didn't let up at all. They certainly could have been happy with that 45-point lead early on in the game, and uh, they didn't. They scored an additional 31 points in the second half, even with the abbreviated 12-minute fourth quarter. So they played well. There was a point there where we thought, at least me watching the game, there could have been an opportunity for Oklahoma to turn the ball over. I mean, not turn the ball over. They turned Western Carolina over, but there was an opportunity for them to possibly give up some points there. So I think that was good that they forced that turnover late, and they preserve the shutout. I think that's going to be a lot of give Oklahoma a lot of momentum going into not only this week, but the conference season, as a whole. So I think that's good. So you got one more game, and then the Big 12 season starts with West Virginia coming into Norman in a week from Saturday. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think from an injury perspective, I know there was some questions about that. I'd seen Denny Sussman tweet out a couple of times where he was supposed to get I know that he was supposed to just have some tests run just to see exactly how, or maybe a CAT scan specifically, just to see how bad his arm was. I know that Lincoln Riley said on both of the injuries with Danny Sussman and Billy Bowman that it wasn't serious. Kind of take that with a grain of salt, at that point to see exactly, how bad the injury is. But, I think, the initial thought that, it wasn't anything too serious, I think is good to hear. At least it wasn't anything, incredibly bad, I think, at this point. So I think that's positive to look at. In both areas, I think both of these kids are potential starters. Obviously, Billy Bowman was a starter in Week 1, and Danny Sussman got a lot more run here in the second game of the year, or of the season. And I don't have the official stats, but I saw last night, I think he had 10 tackles. So at the linebacker position, he played a really good game. So hopefully he's not out for any considerable amount of time. If he is, then obviously next man up mentality. Oklahoma has some depth at those two positions, definitely. So I think that the two areas. I mean, if there's wanting to nitpick the game, I think upon further review, there's three areas that Oklahoma still needs a little bit more work. I think Rattler was still a little iffy in the pocket at times. At times he wouldn't set his feet as much as he needs to. I think he left the pocket and just didn't have as much trust in the offensive line as he really needed to. So that's one area. I think the tackling overall was better, but I had some concerns on a couple of guys just really just not being aggressive and go getting the ball carrier or the receiver versus letting that receiver come to them. And then some of the coverage in the secondary wasn't as tight and as crisp as I would have hoped it would be. So those are the three areas for Oklahoma to I think shore up in practice, areas that they could continue to get better and better as the weeks go on. Coming into the Nebraska game, I had mentioned last night that I thought the betting line would be anywhere from about 17 to 20 points. It was a little bit more than I thought it would be. It's a 22-point spread right now. So Oklahoma's a 22-point favorite against Nebraska. It's just hard to believe. I know Nebraska's not as good as they have been in the past. Obviously, they're not nowhere near what they've been, in the 80s. But I say the 80s, but even more so in the 90s. That I think that you guys watch as much college football as I do, and in 95, there's an argument could be made for that 95 Nebraska team could have been, potentially the best Nebraska team ever. So, let's talk through that as well, what you think about that, and then just talk about some of your, some of your memories. So a couple of mine, and then we'll kind of get to all of your comments and concerns. So understanding that I'm only 40. My dad took me to a few games when I was, when I was younger. So in the mid to late 80s, a few games, but I was too young to even remember or kind of gather exactly what that looked like. So a lot of my game memories started in the 90s. We had season tickets, and I would remember a lot of those games. Obviously it wasn't the best era of college football for Oklahoma. That those 10 years, the 90s was, arguably the worst decade of Oklahoma football that they've had ever. So a couple of games that I remember were unfortunately in the late 90s, 96 and 98, I believe. Those were the two home games where Oklahoma was just throttled. They lost both of those games by 50, 60 points. I think there was one game maybe 77-21 or 77-28, and then there was a 69-7 loss in there, and Oklahoma was just widely competitive in those games as well. So there was a joke that we made before the game started, knowing that Oklahoma didn't have a chance, but my dad and my dad's best friend we would go to the games together, and we always one of the bright spots, especially right then, that time of the Oklahoma history of college football, was really just knowing exactly how good. We just loved the band. We loved the part, when the band would come on the field and play. That was, I'm honestly sad to admit that was one of the highlights. And the one of the things that we said is we were joking about is that that the band needs a football team that they can be proud that they can be proud of. So, and that really wasn't there. But then when you look in 2000, Oklahoma, I think it was for me the first real time that I was able to watch Oklahoma football on the national stage and be there. I remember ESPN College Game Day was there. Obviously not for the first time, but for the first time when OU was in the, I believe I think they were ranked number 3, ironically enough, what they're ranked now. Number 3, Nebraska was number 1, and I remember watching that game and just the atmosphere was so different than anything that I'd ever witnessed at that time. Because, as I said, I just went to games through the '90s, and we went to all the home games, obviously, but they were so bad, and even during the Gary Gibbs era when they were better than obviously they were in the Blake and Schnellenberger years, but they were still pretty average. 8-3 seasons, 7-5, 8-4. Those types of seasons, and but it was just different. You could tell that early on in the game. Just getting to the game at the atmosphere was just so much more electric and better, really than it ever had been. And Oklahoma got off to that a little bit of a slow start, but there was so much excitement still in the stadium. I think there was still a lot of belief. There was a lot of I think concern that a lot of people had, including myself, had some '90s Oklahoma football PTSD. But as you guys know, Oklahoma never looked back. After that, didn't give up another point for the rest of the game. Won the game 31-14, and played just incredible defense the rest of the way against Eric Crouch and company. So that was my exciting performance, and I can't remember how long ago this was. And Oklahoma dominated this game a few years later. I remember there was a pick six early in the game, and I think this was a 2008 season or 2009. I'm trying to remember which. Oklahoma controlled the game from the get go, and there were some other games. The 2001 game was exciting, and then obviously the last time they played was in the Big 12 championship game when Oklahoma won 23-20. So yeah, those were some interesting games and stuff like that. So I'm interested to hear your take as well. Ryan, welcome in, buddy. I appreciate you joining as always. Hopefully this week won't be another game of the century and Oklahoma gets past a bad Nebraska team as easily as they should. Yeah, no, absolutely. If this is another game of the century type in terms of being a close competitive game, I think that's something that will will not be good for the trajectory of the season. I think you never know in these rivalry type games. I know it's not a current rival, but I think, if you're Oklahoma, you have to worry about being a little bit too amped up early in this game, given the fact of, what the first two games were. Certainly last night was better, seemed to look better from a crowd perspective, but there was no doubt. It was just it was really a name the score type of thing. So, I think even with the 11 a.m. kickoff, you'll see another, excited crowd. Certainly there. So, but yeah, I agree with you, Ryan. It shouldn't be. I would hope that it's not a close game. Otherwise we're having a more Tulane-esque post-game show on Saturday. Yeah. So Sooner Throne, I think he's been there. I think this is maybe his fourth year. I know he's a senior at this point, obviously, but I think this is probably either his third or fourth year. Looking at his stats from just kind of pulling them up from from yesterday. Obviously, he was pretty bad, in the first game of the year against Illinois. But looking at him yesterday, he was obviously the leading passer, but he was also the leading rusher for Nebraska yesterday with 9 carries for 112 yards. He had a 71 yarder, so that obviously makes that average go up a little bit more than what it should. But he been passing, he was 13 out of 19 for 242 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no interceptions. So he was better. I think he was better than he was the first couple of games. So not that he's been bad. He hasn't turned the ball over in terms of an interception this year. He's got 4 touchdowns, no interceptions. He has, completed 62% of his passes for 728 yards. So not a lot through the air. When you think 728 yards through 3 games, it's not a ton. But he's a guy that yeah, he'll challenge Oklahoma. Absolutely. Have to be very, very disciplined. Hey Ryan, thanks again. I was in Lincoln for the 2021 game against Nebraska when they hit. What I think you probably mean the 2001 game. I know what you mean. Yeah, I think that was interesting. That was an interesting game because Hibble was not good in that 2001 season. Oklahoma had an unreal defense. They were probably even better on defense in 2001 than they were in the 2000 season as a whole. But they just couldn't get much support on the offense. Offensive line wasn't as good, and then like I said, Nate Hibble was pretty bad, but given that, yeah, I mean, I think the most interesting part of that game, when you look back at it, not at the time, but when you look back at it, was Nebraska was able to execute theirs, and Oklahoma was not able to execute. And Hibble was just couldn't throw the ball downfield as well as Heupel was, and that ended up being the difference. And obviously that season didn't end well for Oklahoma with the loss to Oklahoma State and not even making to the Big 12 championship game. But I think a lot of us remember watching that year. And then we got a little bit of a kick out of watching Chris Sims just kind of puke down his leg against Colorado in that Big 12 championship game. I remember that vividly. The first OU game of over 200 I have been to is 83. We lost 28-21 Nebraska. Yeah, I do remember. I remember that game. I don't remember it. I was 2 years old, but I, kind of looking back and what I've studied through Oklahoma through the years, I do remember. And this is another kind of story. It's on a different scale, but kind of interesting that you brought up. Howard Schnellenberger. So I remember this very vividly in '94 when Oklahoma was going through. I think Jim Donnan was a guy that a lot of people thought that Oklahoma might go after. But they ended up settling on Howard Schnellenberger. I remember the press conference. I was literally, and of course you got to take it with a little bit of a time disparity in terms of how old I was. I was only 13 at the time, but I was an incredibly excited Oklahoma fan. Oklahoma was moving away from the mediocrity that was Gary Gibbs, and he was a good coach. He just wasn't able to bring Oklahoma back to where they were, certainly under Switzer. But when they hired Howard Schnellenberger and he went through his press conference, I was literally in tears. I was kind of bawling, if you can imagine that, just bawling through, through watching that press conference, because I just had a feeling, I didn't know for sure. Obviously, I just had a feeling that was just going to be just a bad hire for Oklahoma. And it ended up being, what I've heard so many call as the reign of terror, and it really was, one of the worst hires and just the worst year of Oklahoma football that they've had. Just in terms of everything going on, obviously some of the win-loss record stuff was a little bit worse under John Blake, but just for how far that he set the program back in just 1 year was, kind of astronomical. Oh, Ryan, I think that's the same comments before. Absolutely. Biggie, thanks for the question. I haven't heard anything about the visit. I know that he was there. I'd heard a couple of people also talk about him being there, but I haven't heard any feedback. Biggie, we'll look to get some feedback for Wednesday's show to look at from a recruiting perspective, how that visit went. Let's see here. Sooners on the best memories 1987 when true. Yeah, so that was really another one of the game of the century type games. I can't remember if it was 86 or 87 that was that it was number one against number two I think it was in '87 here, as you mentioned, that where Oklahoma won the game I think it was 17-7, where they really just kind of dominated throughout. I think Nebraska scored the first touchdown of the game, and then Oklahoma's defense dominated the rest of the game. Absolutely, yeah, really, really big memory there as well. Brandon has a 2000 Nebraska game helped. Awesome, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I think it was the I when you look back at that season, I think you looked at 1999 and Bob Stoops' first year at Oklahoma and look at how much better they were. But they left a lot of meat on the bones, and they were, I believe, 7-5 that year. But they left a lot of meat on the bones in terms of what they could do for this season, for that season for Oklahoma. But 2000 was obviously a magical season. But I think early on, Oklahoma had a big lead against Texas the year before, but they blew it. And then Oklahoma winning that game 63-14, kind of set the table that, hey, this team could be pretty good. And then obviously when they beat Kansas State at Kansas State and really controlled the game for the most part. And then obviously with Nebraska, that was really this was really the game where Oklahoma football got back on the map, so to speak. And they've never really relinquished that since then. They've had I know that there's always a lot of frustration in Oklahoma not winning a playoff game, not winning a national championship since then. But they've still been on the map more times than not over the last 21 years. Really, just in terms of being, when I say on the map, being relevant for the college football season. 22 is too low. I don't know, Brandon. It kind of seems a little high. I mean, I hope Oklahoma plays well and they go win this game easily, and they make a statement, which I think is going to be good. They do have the opportunity. It is a nationally televised game on Fox, and they will have that audience and opportunity to make a statement. And so I hope you're right. I hope I hope it ends up being a little too low. Yeah, I agree. Sooner than I've watched. A lot of times what I'll do in the in the off season, because I'm so starved for football. I've watched some of the old 90s games and things like that, and watched a lot of Nebraska, and they beat the living crap out of everyone that year, including they threw Florida around like a rag doll in the championship game, and they just beat everyone bad. So I think it's definitely the best Husker team of all time, maybe the best college football team of all time. Yeah. I don't think it's really close. I think you could probably make an argument that the '60s or there's a couple of losing seasons in there, but I think it was definitely the worst, the most frustrating for me, and just seeing exactly how bad they were, how bad that program had got. Obviously, it started with Schnellenberger, but Blake, was just not a good head coach again. Really, and it sets your program back a bit when you have two, bad hires back to back. So I think the one thing that you have to give John Blake a lot of credit for was the fact that he got a lot of great kids, into the program. Bob Stoops won that national championship with a decent amount of John Blake's players. So, even though he wasn't able to coach them up and put him in a position to be successful, once they were here, John was able to get a lot of those good kids into the program. Let's see, 2000. Yeah, that was one of the coolest moments of the game, that circus catch where he kicked it up and caught it as well. Yeah, so 2008 was the Bradford game where I think it might have been Dominique Franks that took a I took a pick six back, and then I think Oklahoma just dominated, and they were in the midst of, I think that was the year where they had 5 or 6 straight 60-point games, and that was part of that as well. Yeah, 2009. I do remember that game as well, Sooner Thrown. That was the game where Landry Jones threw, I think, 5 interceptions in the game. Can you imagine what this chat and what Sooner Nation would do to Spencer Rattler if he threw up 3 points and did throw a single touchdown pass and 5 interceptions in a game? So I think we've not, you guys might not have got my stance on Landry Jones, but I think he has the record, and it may be a record that will never be broken, because since he played so many years, and he started and he played in an era where Oklahoma was a little bit more pass happy than they are now. But he's the all-time leading passer at the University of Oklahoma, and I probably don't even put him in my top 10 of quarterbacks in Oklahoma football history. Maybe he's at the end. But give me Heupel, give me Bradford, give me Jason White, give me Baker Mayfield, give me Jalen Hurts, give me Kyler Murray. At this point, even give me Spencer Rattler over him. I just think he was a kid that had a lot of talent in the world, but just made mistakes at the worst times and just would throw just completely ridiculous interceptions. So I'll get off my soapbox with with him, but I don't. He's not. Wasn't one of my favorite Oklahoma Sooners. Keith Jackson one-handed catch. Yeah, that was very, very cool. Very cool. I do remember that, William Penny. How long will Stutzman be out? It looked like a bad injury. Jimmy, I haven't heard anything specifically. I think, I'm just going off what Lincoln Riley said in the press conference yesterday. He said that both of them didn't look like they were going to be severe injuries, that they're going to keep him out for a long period of time. But again, that was immediately after the game. Not sure. I know that he was supposed to get a CAT scan today, but haven't really heard anything specific about the injury front. I would assume, I think Lincoln Riley has his media availability on Tuesday, where he kind of previews the next game, and he. So yeah, I hope he's not. It looked bad. I agree with you, Jimmy. It looked bad, but let's hope and pray that it wasn't something that's going to keep him out of action for a long period of time. Yep, I do remember that Sooner Thrawn. He got injured early in that game, and terrible for him. Very similar to the injury that he suffered the year before, in 2001. I'm sorry, the year before. No. I'm sorry. I've got the 2 years mixed up. His first ACL injury was 2001. Then he injured the other one in 2002 against Alabama, and both crazy non-contact injuries that derailed two of his seasons. Let's see. William Penny, Gary Gibbs' failure had a lot to do with being on probation, and not so much about him. Partially, yeah. I just think that he wasn't. I don't think he was a big players coach. I think he had such a bland personality, and I think he was a guy that was good enough to get Oklahoma to keep the wheels on the bus, so to speak, very much to the degree of what I think Josh Heupel is going to do at Tennessee. I think he's going to be good enough to keep the wheels on the bus. I don't think he's going to be good enough to I don't think he's going to be the long-term answer at Tennessee. So very similar for Gary Gibbs. I think he was a guy that was going to settle the program down. He wasn't going to allow that program to get into any more trouble. But I don't think he was going to be a guy that was going to take Oklahoma to the next phase. I just didn't think he had that in. Great defensive coordinator, great linebacker coach. But I just didn't think that he was going to be great as a head coach and to put Oklahoma, back on the map. Do you think OU's defense can shut out the Huskers? I just don't think so, Mr. John. Just based on where Oklahoma's at right now, they're still finding themselves a little bit defensively. I think this was the thing that I had said before the Tulane game. I think if Oklahoma can hold Nebraska to between 14 and 17 points, I think that will be successful because I think Oklahoma will get into the 40s fairly easily against against Nebraska because let's look at some of these games that Nebraska has played already. When you look at Illinois, that game looks worse and worse each week. Obviously, Illinois got off to that great start, and I think they led Nebraska by like 20 points at one point, and then it ended up being a one-score game. But at the same time, Illinois pretty much dominated that game after second quarter to probably midway through the fourth quarter. They dominated that game. And what does Illinois do? They go and they lose at home to Texas San Antonio, and then they go get drilled by Virginia 42-14 this past Saturday. So I think when you look at that game, don't know exactly when we look at the end of the season if this is going to be a game that Nebraska looks at and says, how in the world did we even not only lose that game, but keep that game close, or is this what Nebraska is? And they're maybe a 6-6 team, maybe a 5-7 team, flirting with a bowl bid. So I think I think a good performance for Oklahoma, John, would be holding Nebraska to 7 to 10 points. I think they've got they've got enough good players on their team to at some point they will I think they'll score. So I think if they can hold the Huskers to 10 to 17 points, I think that will be a success. Absolutely. John Jackson, do you think that got Rattler back into the Heisman race? I think he's still there, John, and I think the reason why he's certainly not the leader right now. Bryce Young from Alabama is absolutely the leader, but I think there's a long list of those guys who are at number 2. I don't think some of the guys that coming into the season. JT Daniels from Georgia was a guy that was there, but he didn't have a great game one, and then he was out yesterday with an injury. And then we look at DJ Uiagalelei as well. Didn't have a solid game one, and then played. Didn't play a ton yesterday against South Carolina State, but so those are a couple of guys. I think when you look at Breece Hall for Iowa State, he was kind of in the mix. Hasn't had a really good year thus far. Iowa State losing didn't hurt. It didn't help, I should say. Bijan Robinson was kind of up there. Then Texas loses, and he has just kind of a so-so game as well. So I think he's there. He's probably top 3, I would say, at this point. I don't know that who. I think it's interesting. You'll have to catch we have an article for every week at Last Word on College Football that kind of speaks to. We give our staff picks for the Heisman. I think right now I probably would have Rattler either number 2 or number 3. I would put CJ Verdell in there just because of how great of a game that he had on the road. I think he had over 170 yards rushing and a couple of scores, maybe 3 touchdowns. I think against Ohio State. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that. But how that kind of works itself. But I do think that he wasn't completely out. He was obviously number 1 coming into the season right there with Sam Howell. But I think he's probably right around 2, 3, 4 right now. Probably closer to 2 or 3. I think right now. Ryan, what, if any, danger do you think Nebraska poses to Oklahoma this week? If Nebraska can win, how will they do it? So I think how Nebraska wins is obviously keeping the Oklahoma offense off the field. Their offensive line is not strong. We watched that game against Illinois. They struggled to run the ball consistently. I think the biggest run of the game was an Adrian Martinez scramble when she went 70 plus for a score. And when you look at it, even last week, this past week, they weren't incredibly strong running the ball. Even against a team like Buffalo. So I think they had, looking at that, they had 41 carries for 220 yards. So that 5.4 looks good, but then when you look, when you take out, they have 2 runs two runs of 92 yards. So when you take that out, they got 39 carries for 130 yards. That's barely even three yards a carry, if that. So I think in order for Nebraska to win, they've got to be able to run the football successfully. Adrian Martinez has got to stay away from the turnovers. I think that's one thing and then he's got to be able to run the ball successfully. Like I said, he ran for 112 here. He ran for right around 100, maybe even more. While we're talking, I'll just kind of pull up the Illinois stats here, and then to see exactly how much he ran for. 111 against Illinois. And then let's look at Fordham. I think I said earlier the score was 44-7. They won 52-7 as well. And he was not the leading rusher. USC transfer Marquis Stepp was the leading rusher in that game as well. So I think their ability to run the football, if they can run the football successfully and put a little bit more pressure on Oklahoma's defense, if Oklahoma is able to get them into some predictable third and long situations where that pass rush and that defensive line can kind of tee off on them. So I think that will be long. Could be a long day for him if they're not able to get into third and mediums and third and in unpredictable situations where they get to dictate what they run on offense. When you look defensively, I think they have to be first of all, they have to have the ability to stop the run against Oklahoma. When you look at some of those games against Fordham, they gave up 4.6 yards per carry. Let's look at some of these other stats let's look against Illinois. Only 3.5 yards per carry against Illinois, but then let's look against Buffalo, who Buffalo is by and large, they run the ball more often than they pass, even though it was a little bit on the opposite side as they threw 50 times and ran 33, but they ran 33 for 135 yards, 4.1 yards per carry. So I think, that they have to be able to make Oklahoma one-dimensional and force Rattler into some mistakes. I think that's what they really need to do. Not Adrian Martinez has to be good. I think, he's got to probably throw for 250, run for another 125 for them to have success and make Oklahoma one-dimensional and make Rattler continue to make good decisions, play after play, and really force him to beat you. I think that's the recipe for success for Nebraska on Saturday. It's really tough to answer Sooner Thrawn. I think they looked better. They looked just horrible against Tulane. If I'm being honest. I think the run game was just out of sync. I think when you look at Eric Gray, he wasn't very patient running the football. I think he was I don't know, just it just looked a little weird. Didn't look like the same guy in the spring. I think he wasn't as patient. I think he was just expecting maybe the hole to be there a little bit. So you could tell he got coached up a lot here this week by DeMarco. He was much more patient. I think the thing that I like that that Oklahoma ran, again, you have to take the team that they played into consideration. But they 38 carries for 277 yards, which is about 7.3 yards per carries, 5 touchdowns on the ground. So I think it's a little bit better than I thought. Sooner Thrawn after the first game, but still they got to go do this against a decent team, right? I mean, I don't think when you look at Nebraska, certainly Oklahoma's going to play some teams that are better than them. Iowa State's better. Texas is better. I think West Virginia is probably better. But I think those things kind of remain to be seen exactly what what some of those teams will look like. But they've got some athletes up front on defense that are going to give the offensive line is going to be a good test for the offensive line just to see exactly how how good they can be, how good they can play. Absolutely. What about the Tennessee guys, Morris and Lawrence did not play hardly at all. He played later in the game, I think. So maybe they were just a little bit happier with some of the other safeties. Delaire and Turner and Pat Fields obviously were the two starters. So they played a little bit more. Wanya Morris got some more time. He got more time early on. He spelled Anton Harrison just a bit there at left tackle. So they got a little bit more playing time, definitely. So was really encouraged by the defensive line, specifically the young kids. We talked about Ethan Downs. I thought he was the best of the younger kids by far. Him and Danny Stutzman both played extremely well. Got a big motor. I think he's a guy that's going to maybe play a little bit more here on the defensive line. They're going to, and they talked a little bit about this in in some of the discussions leading up to the game, but they played a few more. They played about 31 guys on defense, and they talked about they're going to trim that down a little bit. So I think you'll see that trim down a little bit more here in this game against Nebraska. And they're going to rely on the ones and twos probably a little bit more than they did the first couple of games. But they had the opportunity. But I think it shows the depth that they have on all areas of the team when you look at how well they were able to play in the back end of that game last night. In the second half, still outscoring Western Carolina 31-0 in the second half. After building that big lead at halftime. So I think that's big to show, the depth that they have if they get a couple of guys injured or not. But I do think that you'll see that. I think you'll see that the amount of guys that Oklahoma plays specifically on defense will get trimmed down a little bit. Then when you look at the offensive side of the ball, I think, looking at that, I was really interested and still interested to see Jaden Knowles and Todd Hudson get a little bit more playing time, obviously I know that it was going to start in mop-up duty, but I think watching that yesterday had me a little bit more comfortable with where we're at, from a running back depth perspective. I think Jaden Knowles can be a guy that can play some serious time if he's pressed into duty. I think Todd Hudson wasn't bad at all. Don't take this. I just think that Jaden Knowles is a little bit more ready. I think he's a little bigger. Can take the pounding maybe a little bit more than a Todd Hudson can. So I like him a little bit better out of the backfield from a receiving perspective as well. So certainly could see him getting some playing time. Especially if something happens to Eric Gray or Kennedy Brooks, or just maybe even a change of pace guy for Oklahoma. Coming into the the rest of the season, so to speak. Just kind of going down the line. Look at the receivers. I think you've got a solid top three. When you look at Jaden Hazelwood, Mario Williams, and Marvin Mims. I think those are three guys that are going to play a ton. They're still dependable. Mike Woods is there as well. Hasn't got as many looks, and I think that's probably just. I think it's probably just due to the fact that him and Rattler haven't had a lot of time together yet. To kind of build that chemistry and that kind of camaraderie between the two. But I think as the season goes on, he'll get some more touches, and he'll certainly get some more. Looks in the flow of the offense. Good to see Drake Stoops back. Brian Darby, I think, is a guy that's going to play, still continue to play some, but I think Oklahoma has some good weapons. I think the H-back spot is a little interesting. Austin Stogner just still doesn't look quite like himself yet. So Braden Willis looks, he's a guy that can play a lot for Oklahoma. So I think, Oklahoma's set there, as well. I think they can absorb, should something happen, they can absorb some injuries all across the board, more so than they have in the past. So, the questions and comments have stopped, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up for, this week's edition of After Further Review. So thanks everybody for joining. I certainly appreciate you guys. We got 40 on the line. So remember, on Saturday, I'm fully expecting post game for us to have for us to have over 100 at some point. We've got like 43. I think we peaked at almost 49 today, this afternoon, on a Sunday afternoon, NFL afternoon. So thanks everybody for joining. Let's get to 100 on Saturday, and join us at 11:30 on Wednesday as we talk through as we start talking about Oklahoma and just how better they were this week, and then kind of what to look for against Nebraska on Saturday. And I'll look at some more film here and just kind of get a better idea of what Oklahoma's facing just from a personnel perspective, and we'll talk through that in the in the post game or in the pregame as well. So we'll do that at 11:30 on Wednesday, and then obviously join us Saturday morning for our pregame show, count down the kickoff, and then we'll get you going up until probably about 10, and then or 9:30ish, 10, and then we'll come here with postgame again. So thanks everybody joining. Have a good week, and we will see you guys on Wednesday. Boomer Sooner.